What would you do if a group of strangers moved into your town and suddenly decided your way of life didn't belong? Caleb had never questioned his place in the world. His farm wasn't just a business, it was his legacy, passed down through generations, a living testament to his family's hard work. The soil beneath his boots had felt the weight of his father's and grandfather's steps before him, and every harvest was a reminder that he was part of something greater than himself. His land was alive, not just with crops but with buzzing bees, rustling leaves, and the rhythmic clucking of chickens at sunrise. It was a place where the cycle of life played out in harmony with nature, and Caleb took pride in nurturing that balance. But everything changed when the new neighborhood was built just a few miles down the road. At first, it was just houses, identical, freshly painted, with perfectly trimmed lawns that looked almost unnatural against the rolling farmland. The developers had called it Maple Ridge Estates, marketing it as a serene countryside retreat for families looking to escape city life. Caleb had no issue with newcomers. If anything, he thought they might appreciate the beauty of rural living. Then came the HOA. Led by Karen, a woman whose clipboard seemed permanently attached to her hand, the Homeowners Association presented itself as a well-meaning organization that simply wanted to maintain community standards. Caleb paid little attention at first, he wasn't part of their development, after all. But it didn't take long for their definition of community to start encroaching on his land. The first complaints arrived in his mailbox like unwelcome guests. Your property is an eyesore. The sight of your farm equipment disrupts the neighborhood aesthetic. The smell of compost is a nuisance. Caleb read them twice, then a third time, shaking his head in disbelief. These people had chosen to move next to a farm, and now they were complaining that it looked like one. It was almost laughable, but the letters didn't stop. Instead, they multiplied, each one demanding changes: trim your hedges, remove your chicken coop, relocate your compost piles. It was as if they expected him to turn his working farm into a neatly manicured park just to fit their vision of the countryside. He decided to handle it the way he always did, with patience. He invited HOA members to tour his farm, hoping they'd see what he saw: a thriving, self-sustaining ecosystem, a place where nature and agriculture coexisted in perfect rhythm. But when Karen arrived, she barely glanced at the rich rows of vegetables or the wildflowers buzzing with pollinators. Instead, she wrinkled her nose at a few scattered tools and made notes on her clipboard. "This doesn't align with community guidelines," she said, her voice clipped. Caleb frowned. "This isn't part of your community. This land has been farmed for generations." Karen didn't even look up. "We'll be sending you an official notice." That was the moment Caleb realized they weren't just neighbors with different opinions. This was something else. A power play. A fight over who had the right to exist in this space. And if Karen thought he was going to roll over and let them erase his farm, she was in for a surprise. Caleb had dealt with plenty of challenges in his years as a farmer: droughts, storms, pests, unpredictable markets, but he had never faced an enemy quite like Karen and her HOA. At first, he had dismissed the letters as nothing more than a nuisance, the kind of petty complaints that would die down once the newcomers adjusted to life in the countryside. But instead of disappearing, the HOA only became more aggressive. The next letter arrived with a red stamp across the envelope: "Final notice." Caleb tore it open, his pulse quickening. The HOA had issued him official violations, citing everything from the height of his barn to the unauthorized presence of livestock. According to their so-called community guidelines, all properties had to maintain a uniform aesthetic, which apparently meant no visible farm equipment, no free-roaming animals, and, most absurdly, no untrimmed hedges. It was laughable. Except it wasn't. That same week, two men in suits showed up at the edge of his property, clipboards in hand, scrutinizing his land like they were surveying a crime scene. Caleb walked over, wiping his hands on his jeans, forcing himself to stay calm. "Something I can help you with?" he asked. One of the men barely glanced up from his notes. Routine inspection. HOA complaint. Caleb clenched his jaw. I'm not in your HOA. The man finally looked at him, expression blank. New guidelines extend to all properties within a 1-mile radius of Maple Ridge Estates. Caleb's stomach tightened. 1 mile. That meant him. He had lived on this land his entire life, and now a group of suburban newcomers thought they could rewrite the rules to push him out. He refused to comply. He tossed the violation notices into a drawer and got back to work. But Karen wasn't done. The next move was even worse. A few days later, Caleb turned on his irrigation system and found nothing but air sputtering from the pipes. His water supply had been cut off. He called the county office, expecting a mistake, but what he got instead was a bureaucratic nightmare. Your water usage has been flagged for review, a monotone voice informed him over the phone. There were complaints about excessive consumption. It's been deemed necessary to restrict access until further notice. Caleb gripped the receiver. Excessive consumption? I'm a farmer. I need water for my crops. I'm sorry, sir, but you'll need to file an appeal. It could take several weeks for review. Several weeks. By then, his crops would be dead. Caleb wasn't an idiot, he knew exactly who was behind this. Karen had pulled strings, twisted regulations, and wielded her HOA's influence like a weapon. First, she had tried to bury him under paperwork. Now, she was cutting off his farm's lifeline. His frustration turned into pure rage when he discovered what happened next. Late one night, Caleb heard the sound of tires crunching over gravel. He stepped onto his porch just in time to see a group of people standing near his rainwater collection tanks, his only remaining water source. Before he could call out, a loud crash echoed through the dark. The unmistakable shattering of plastic. He sprinted toward them, but by the time he reached the tanks, they were already fleeing into the night. His rain barrels lay in shattered pieces, water spilling uselessly onto the ground. Karen wasn't just trying to force him out, she was destroying his ability to survive. The next morning, he confronted her directly. He stormed into the Maple Ridge HOA office, where Karen sat behind a sleek, polished desk. She didn't even look surprised to see him. "You've crossed the line," Caleb said, voice tight with fury. Karen folded her hands neatly. "I have no idea what you're talking about. My water supply has been cut off. My rain barrels were destroyed. And now, you've rewritten your ridiculous HOA rules to try and regulate my land?" Karen sighed, leaning back in her chair. "Caleb, I understand that change can be difficult, but you have to see this from the community's perspective. People moved here for peace and order. Your farm is disruptive." "Disruptive?" Caleb repeated. "You moved next to me, Karen. You and your HOA. My farm was here before a single one of your cookie-cutter houses was built." She gave him a tight smile. "Well, it's here now. And the homeowners have certain expectations." Caleb was boiling inside, but Karen wasn't finished. She slid a folder across the desk. "You might want to read this," she said. "We've taken legal action. The HOA has filed for eminent domain." Caleb's breath caught in his throat. He flipped open the folder, scanning the paperwork with growing disbelief. They were trying to seize his land. The HOA claimed his farm was a public nuisance and that the land would be better utilized as a community park. But Caleb wasn't stupid. This wasn't about a park. Karen's husband was a real estate developer. They wanted him gone so they could cash in on his land. The rage he felt at that moment was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Karen smiled as if she had already won. "You have two choices," she said. "Take the payout and leave quietly. Or fight us in court, where you'll lose anyway." Caleb stared at the contract in front of him, the words blurring together. Karen had been escalating this war step by step, but now she had made her biggest move. She was ready to take everything from him. And that was the moment Caleb decided he would fight back with everything he had. Caleb sat in his truck outside the HOA office, staring at the papers Karen had smugly handed him. The words eminent domain burned into his mind, his pulse hammering in his ears. The HOA was making their final move, and if they won, he wouldn't just lose a battle, he'd lose everything. His farm. His home. The land that had been in his family for generations. But if Karen thought he would go down without a fight, she was in for a hell of a surprise. The first thing he did was call a lawyer. The news wasn't great. Eminent domain was a nightmare to fight. The HOA had carefully framed their argument, claiming his farm was a public nuisance, citing everything from unpleasant odors to unregulated agricultural practices. Their real goal wasn't a park, it was wiping him off the map so they could expand their suburban empire. His attorney warned him that these cases could take years to resolve, and in the meantime, the HOA would keep tightening the screws. And they did. The next week, Caleb woke up to the sound of trucks idling at the edge of his property. He threw on his boots and stormed outside, only to find county officials unloading fencing materials onto the land just past his property line. "What the hell is this?" he demanded. A stone-faced official handed him a document. New HOA mandated perimeter fencing. Restricted access for safety reasons. Caleb's stomach clenched. The HOA was physically fencing him in. The new barriers would block his access to public roads, making it nearly impossible for trucks to deliver supplies or pick up shipments of his produce. Fury boiled inside him. "You can't do this." The official barely blinked. "The HOA has approved it. You'll need to file an appeal if you have concerns." An appeal. Another bureaucratic dead end. Another game of delay and suffocation. Then came the worst of it. A week later, Caleb was fixing a section of his field when he heard the distant sound of sirens. His gut twisted as he saw a convoy of animal control vehicles rumbling down the road toward his farm. He dropped his tools and ran, his heart slamming against his ribs. By the time he reached the front yard, they were already unloading carriers, moving toward his chicken coop and goat pen. A sharp-dressed man in an official vest approached him, clipboard in hand. "Sir, we've received reports of health violations related to your livestock," he announced. "Under county ordinance, we are authorized to remove these animals pending further investigation." Caleb's vision went red. Health violations? According to who? The man barely glanced up. Anonymous complaints. Multiple sources. Caleb clenched his fists. Anonymous complaints. Right. Karen. "You can't just show up and take my animals without proof," he growled. The man tapped the clipboard. "We have documentation." Caleb knew damn well what that meant. Fabricated reports. False evidence. Karen had rigged the system against him, again. His goats, his chickens, gone. Hauled away in metal crates while he stood there, powerless to stop it. The sounds of distressed clucking and bleating faded as the trucks disappeared down the road. He stood in the silence that followed, breathing hard, his hands curled into fists. This wasn't just about regulations anymore. Karen was tearing apart his life piece by piece. And he had had enough. That night, Caleb didn't sleep. He sat on his porch, staring out over his darkened fields, rage simmering beneath his skin. The HOA had been pushing him step by step, thinking he'd break, thinking he'd surrender. They were wrong. Karen had made one fatal mistake. She had underestimated him. A slow, determined grin spread across his face. If the HOA wanted a war, he'd give them one. But not on their terms. On his. Caleb knew he couldn't win this fight through traditional means. The HOA had the money, the legal team, and the bureaucratic connections to keep crushing him under endless paperwork and fabricated complaints. If he played by their rules, he would lose. But what if he changed the game entirely? Lying awake that night, an idea formed in his mind, wild, absurd, impossible to ignore. If the HOA wanted to paint him as a nuisance, then maybe it was time to show them what a real nuisance looked like. Not with threats, not with lawsuits, but with something far more dangerous to people like Karen: public humiliation. By morning, the plan had fully taken shape. He called in favors from every friend, farmer, and local business owner who was sick of the HOA's overreach. The response was immediate. "I'm in," said his neighbor Henry, a retired cattle rancher. "They tried to fine me for a fence color violation." "A damn fence. My cafe got slapped with a non-conforming signage citation," grumbled Lisa, who ran the only diner in town. "They said my chalkboard menu clashed with the HOA aesthetic." Even residents from inside the HOA neighborhood, those who had once supported it, were turning against it. The animal seizure had been the final straw for many, proving that Karen wasn't just enforcing rules, she was weaponizing them. So Caleb got to work. For the next week, he organized the biggest spectacle the town had ever seen, a direct, unapologetic act of defiance, disguised as a community celebration. They called it Airstrike Against the HOA Day. On the morning of the event, Caleb's farm was transformed. Bright banners reading, "Farming is Freedom," and "Down with HOA Tyranny" hung across the fields. Giant inflatable airplanes bobbed in the wind, a ridiculous yet striking symbol of their protest. And the games, oh, the games. There was a rubber chicken toss, where players hurled rubber chickens at a giant target labeled HOA violations, each section with an actual fine the HOA had issued. There was Pin the Fine on the Farmer, where people could spin blindfolded and slap an outrageous HOA fine onto a giant poster of a blank farm, showcasing how arbitrary their rules were. And, of course, the grand finale, a parade of tractors, livestock, and hay bales, rolling straight past the Maple Ridge HOA offices. Hundreds showed up. Local news crews arrived. Even regional stations got wind of it, eager to cover the spectacle of a small-town farmer fighting back against an oppressive HOA. But the best part came when Karen and the HOA board finally showed up, looking absolutely horrified. Karen, standing at the edge of the crowd, clutching her ever-present clipboard like a shield, sneered. "This is completely inappropriate. You can't just mock community standards like this." Caleb, standing in the center of the chaos, grinned. "I thought you wanted neighborhood unity. Look around, Karen. This is a community." But she wasn't listening. Her eyes were darting toward the news cameras, realizing, too late, that she had lost control of the narrative. And then, the unexpected twist. A young woman, dressed in business casual, approached Caleb from the crowd. "Are you Caleb Turner?" "Depends who's asking," he said warily. She extended a hand. "My name's Rebecca. I work for the State Attorney General's office. We received some interesting documents recently about HOA misconduct." Caleb blinked. "Documents?" She nodded. "A whistleblower sent us internal HOA emails proving fraudulent complaints, falsified health reports, and HOA members financially benefiting from property seizures." Caleb's heart pounded. A whistleblower? Someone from inside the HOA had turned on them? Rebecca turned toward Karen, who had gone pale. "Ma'am, we need to have a conversation." And just like that, in front of news cameras, townspeople, and half the county, the HOA's house of cards began to collapse. Caleb stood at the edge of his farm, watching as the last of the news vans packed up and drove off, their coverage of the HOA's downfall now making waves beyond their small town. The community had spoken, and for once, the right side had won. Karen was finished. The very next day, the state launched an official investigation into the HOA, citing fraud, abuse of power, and unethical property seizure attempts. The whistleblowers' leaked emails exposed Karen's direct involvement in falsifying complaints, cutting Caleb's water supply, and orchestrating the removal of his livestock under false pretenses. The final nail in the coffin? The revelation that her husband's real estate company had been planning to acquire Caleb's farm at a massive discount once the HOA forced him out. Karen resigned in disgrace, but that wasn't enough for the community. The HOA board collapsed under public pressure, with residents voting to dissolve it entirely rather than allow another leader to take over. By the end of the month, all HOA-imposed rules were overturned, and Maple Ridge Estates became what it was supposed to be from the start, a neighborhood, not a dictatorship. With the HOA gone, Caleb's farm thrived once more. His animals were returned, his water access restored, and his business boomed as new customers, many of them former HOA members, flocked to buy his produce, eager to support the man who had stood his ground. Even the town council stepped in, passing ordinances to protect farmers from future HOA interference. Karen, on the other hand, quietly moved away, unable to face the town she had once tried to control. Standing on his porch that evening, Caleb took a deep breath, inhaling the familiar scent of soil and fresh air. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light over the fields that were finally, truly his again. He had fought back, not with lawsuits or threats, but with creativity, community, and sheer determination. He had turned his battle into a movement, proving that one person, backed by the right people, could take on even the most powerful bureaucratic machine and win. As the first stars flickered to life in the night sky, he couldn't help but smile. He had beaten the HOA at their own game, and in doing so, he had reclaimed more than just his land. He had reclaimed his freedom. Have you ever felt powerless against HOA, or Karen, rules? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.